Welcome back. Joining us now, member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Republican Congressman Adam Kinzinger of Illinois. Congressman Kinzinger is Lieutenant Colonel in the Air National Guard. Great to have you on the show. I'd like to start off asking you about fellow Congressman Justin Amash. He made a pretty strong case for impeachment. Do you disagree with the case that he made, or is it something that you'd rather refrain from commenting on, and if so, why?
No, I do disagree with him because, look, I like Justin personally, like we get along, but there's really never been anything out here politically or in policy that we agree on, and this is one of those too. Look, I read the Mueller Report. I think a lot of congressmen, maybe most congressmen have, as you know, it's long, and there's a lot of legalese. But when I read it, I said, look, first off, there's no evidence of collusion, and then when it comes to the obstruction issue, there's no final thing mentioned on that. And then what it comes down to is people that were responsible were held responsible. So you have Manafort, et cetera, that are now serving time. So I look at that and go, look, even the Democrats aren't saying impeach right now. So this idea that there's going to be some dam in the Republicans breaking, I think is unrealistic.
So you see the Mueller report differently than he does. Do you think that the Attorney General committed perjury and lied?
No, not that I've seen, no. And, I get that this is, when Mueller basically came out and said we don't have evidence to say let's indict and send the president to jail, it created this kind of storm out here because a lot of people invest in this narrative. And so now they're going to do investigation and after investigation. And look, they're in the majority. That's their opportunity, their option to do it. I just disagree. And when you have most of the Democrats not even saying impeachment, again, this idea that there's going to be some shift in the Republican belief, I think is unrealistic.
So when the Attorney General testified before Congress at the hearing, you don't think that he lied or committed perjury? You don't think he should be held in contempt? Like, you did not hear anything that he said that was untrue?
No, I mean, look, I don't see evidence for perjury. I don't see evidence to hold him in contempt. I'm always open to any case made by any side. I want to be a fair congressman out here. I want to do the right thing. But I don't see that. What I see is, again, a party that really invested a lot in a nomination or in a narrative and now is really desperate to see that narrative through.
Willie.
Hey, Congressman, it's Willie. Guys, good to see you as always. I like to get you in always on military matters as someone who raised his hand and flew missions over Afghanistan and Iraq both. A lot of people concerned right now, perhaps because of the experience of the lead up to Iraq, about what's going on with Iran, moving those carrier strike groups, the talk of the credible threats from Iran-backed groups inside Iraq. From where you're sitting, from what you know, how concerned should Americans be, number one, about the threat of Iran, and number two, about the threat of a potential war with the United States and Iran?
I think concerned but not losing sleep over it. So if you look back at Iranian behavior in the region for years, it's really been the same. And if you look at during the fight against ISIS, one of the concerns we had is that Iran, before even Trump was president, that Iran was going to energize the Shia militias in Iraq. And we saw that potentially with this rocket attack near the Green Zone. We've had that concern. We see what they're doing in Yemen, supporting the Houthi rebels, putting military equipment in cities so that they get bombed and kill civilians. We see, obviously, that tragedy there, 50,000 dead children, 500,000 Syrians, and upholding that corrupt government. So Iranian behavior in the region has been terrible and atrocious. And I think the administration is correct to respond strongly to legitimate threats, because I actually think when you know that the U.S. military would destroy you, which we would, it actually makes Iranian challenges to American personnel less likely. And frankly, if they do it, we should have a option to be able to defend our people and our allies.
And are you okay, Congressman, with the sort of the rhetoric that's coming from President Trump? Yesterday he said, well, we don't really have a specific threat, but if there is one, we'll be ready for it, where previously he'd said, we've got a credible threat, and if Iran continues to threaten the United States, effectively we will destroy Iran.
Yeah, I don't necessarily agree with how the president puts everything all the time. But I'll tell you in this case, I think in this case, look, it's a legitimate threat from Iran. I mean, if we see short-range missiles within striking distance of American forces, Iran constantly says Israel's the little Satan, the U.S. is the big Satan. Eventually, you have to actually take them at their words. And if you see that a quarter of Americans killed in the Iraq war were killed directly or indirectly by Iranian technology or intelligence services, they obviously are not scared of fighting American interests. And so Look, I think this is one of those areas. You may hate President Trump, you may love him. This is one of those things where, as Americans, we still have to find areas of agreement, and one of those is defending our people overseas.
Hey, Congressman, changing the topic here a bit. I don't know about when you were in high school, but when I was in high school, they taught a course called civics, and you'd find out about checks and balances and things like that in the legislative process. So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on the White House's consistent refusal to respond to any subpoenas issued by the United States House of Representatives?
Well, it's tough to tell on some of them. I think if there's legitimate executive privilege, then they should be able to file executive privilege. I think if there's not, then we should get as much of the story as we can. And so I'm not mired on that committee in the day-to-day, the reasoning and everything. I just watch it basically on the news and get information here. And my view is I think Congress should be an equal branch to the presidency. So areas where, we do have a legitimate concern, then yes. But, things like getting the president's tax returns, every American, even the president of the United States, has a right to keep those private unless Congress can show a compelling reason. And right now it just appears the compelling reason is just because he hasn't done it yet, which is not required of a president of the United States.
Congressman Jonathan Lemire has a question for you. John?
All right.
Congressman, what to follow up with what Mike just asked. I mean, the White House has basically said that they're only going to cooperate. They believe that Congress only has any investigative ability if they can connect it to forthcoming legislation, which is an extraordinarily narrow view of what Congress is supposed to do. Do you agree with that?
I don't know. I mean, look, I'm not, an expert in these questions. I just hear from people what's going on. I hear a very compelling argument about why there should be executive privilege and why when people, for instance, go and testify to a grand jury, they should be able to have that information protected and given to Mueller, and it doesn't have to necessarily come out and be displayed over public. There's sanctity in the grand jury. But again, if there's areas where I hear compelling evidence that, Congress has a right to hear from these folks, then yeah, sure. The Democrats ultimately, though, they're putting a lot of investment in this narrative, and that's a political question for them. They have the majority. It's just that's how it's going to play out in many cases is in politics.
Congressman, I want to ask you about Syria. You're writing a bipartisan letter with some others about the attacks on Idlib. What are you asking for?
Well, I think the president, the administration, and frankly, the Western free world and the UN should come out and call for these things to be halted. You look at what the Russians are doing. They're focus on like Khashoggi, which is a tragic situation. The Russians killed journalists. They've killed a number of journalists. Right now, the Russians and Syrians are intentionally bombing hospitals in Idlib. Hospitals. In fact, there's concern that UN was provided locations of these hospitals for humanitarian reasons, and that the Russians are actually using those coordinates to make the strike. This is awful. This is evil. And this is something where, frankly, we spend a lot of time talking about a lot of stuff, which is important. This is extremely tragic, and this is creating the next generation of ISIS if we're not careful.
Congressman Adam Kinzinger, thank you very much for being our guest this morning.
You bet, anytime. Thanks.
And this morning, thank you.